welcome to L&DMatter's podcast series. You're currently listening to episode 1 regarding neurodiversity, and without further ado, let's begin. Today, we're here with me, Dhruv.
Hi, I'm Manasvi.
And I'm Shambhavi.
And with that, let's begin. So before we get too far ahead, let's just get through some definitions just so that we know what we're talking about. Neurodiversity as a term refers to the variations and diversity of the human mind. What's important to recognize about this definition is that neurodiversity is simply a biological fact, not a trait, perspective, opinion, or any other quality of the sort. A popular metaphor is just like how there's a variety of car companies, there's a variety of the human mind as well. Now, we also have to understand the neurodiversity paradigm. The simplest way of explaining what this idea represents is to utilize the definition set by Nick Walker. He lays out 3 subpoints for the larger paradigm. Number 1, neurodiversity is a natural form of human diversity. Number 2, there isn't a normal or healthy type of brain. And number 3, neurodiversity is just like any other type of diversity, whether that be race or ethnicity. All of this boils down to the idea that there isn't a right or wrong brain, and that everyone is unique in their own way. However, there has been some backlash against this perspective, with critics claiming that because such neurodevelopmental conditions interfere with tasks like eating, walking, and talking, they should quote unquote be cured to support neurodivergent individuals in their daily lives. What are your guys' thoughts about the neurodiversity paradigm?
I think, well, for the straight up definition, I think it's a pretty good paradigm because he outlines like a pretty inclusive definition of what neurodiversity is, and he doesn't really limit it to a certain sort of thing. And with like curing neurodivergence, some neurodivergent individuals, their disability doesn't impact their life in a significant way that they would want to cure. And so while those critics may be saying there needs to be cures for individuals with disabilities that are incredibly debilitating, that's when they might need a cure and where it interferes with their life in a significant way. But for a large percentage of individuals with disabilities, that's not the case, and they would like to just live with their disability and be accepted.
Yeah, for sure. Another good way to think about this paradigm is through Carl LeBoyd's analogy. Imagine there's a square snowflake and a triangle snowflake. The neurodiversity paradigm voices that we shouldn't force the square to become a triangle or the triangle to become a square, and rather allow both the triangle and the square to appreciate their own unique quirks. Once again, remember, neurodiversity itself is a biological fact, but the neurodiversity paradigm is a specific perspective. It's also important to discuss the neurodiversity movement. What is it? It's a social reform movement that's being led to secure equity and fundamental rights for those that are neurodivergent. Think of the movement just like the renowned civil rights movement and the women's rights movement. All 3 of these movements advocated or currently advocate for equity and social justice. Another way of thinking about this movement is in the way Dr. Barry Prisnick coins. He voices that the core ideology of the movement is that neurodivergent individuals don't need to quote unquote be cured, but to rather allow them to appreciate themselves for who they are. Those were a lot of definitions, but we still have a couple of questions left. What's the neurodivergent spectrum? What's neurodiverse and what's neurodivergent? What's classified as neurodivergent? Manasvi can talk about that now.
Yep. Let's take a look at the neurodivergent spectrum. We've already established what neurodiversity is, but what are the ends of the spectrum? What is the spectrum in general? To break it down, there are 2 ends per se. There's neurodiverse individuals or people who possess developmental disorders or learning disabilities. On the other end of the spectrum, there are neurotypical individuals who are within the range of typical human neurology. Originally, this terminology was used by the autistic community to refer to non-autistic people. Now, it's coined by many who are neurodivergent to refer to those who are, you guessed it, neurotypical. The in-between is a little complicated. Just because a person isn't more neurodiverse or less neurodiverse than another, even though some definitions may depend on ability. Rather, the in-between that I like using is one that includes all developmental disorders, learning disabilities within the spectrum, but an individual's placement may vary due to how they feel they diverge from the behavior of a neurotypical individual. Now, as Dhruv mentioned previously, the concept or idea of neurodiversity was mainly created to include all individuals that were neurologically atypical. For historical context, there was no such term that was all-inclusive to bring the neurodiverse community under a single term due to the fact that it was only the autism spectrum that was widely accepted. It wasn't until 1998 when Judy Singer first used the term that all individuals who are neurodiverse could refer back to or be a part of such a community. The main dispute about the spectrum, however, is the extent of the inclusivity. The spirit of neurodiversity is to be all-inclusive. However, there are some who argue that people who either develop such a disability later in life, such as Parkinson's, or have cerebral palsy, are not included. Just to clarify, Parkinson's disease is a progressive nervous system disease that can eventually cause tremors, change in speech, etc. Cerebral palsy is a group of disorders that affects movement or musculature as defined by Mayo Clinic. Disabilities that are commonly accepted within the spectrum are ADHD or autism. ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is when a person possesses inattentiveness or hyperactive impulsive behavior. Autism or autism spectrum disorder, defined simply, is a condition related to brain development that impacts how a person perceives or socializes with others, causing problems in social interaction and communication, once again defined by Mayo Clinic. Now, with all of these things defined, what do you guys think about the inclusivity within neurodiversity and the main dispute about what sort of disorders or disabilities to include or involve within neurodiversity?
The way I think about it, neurodiversity has also become this sort of larger than itself movement that includes like the idea of just viewing something as typical or atypical in general. And in the way that like neurodiversity is centered around the brain and by extension the nervous system, it also like would include diseases that like Parkinson's that might be developed later on, or other conditions that are just affected by the nervous system. So in that way, I think that neurodiversity really is including um, other conditions, but I think that it also like just by what it represents is including like the disability community as a whole.
Yeah. I think if you go back to even the definition, it was like all variations of the mind. And I think that's including many different conditions. And even further than that, as Shambhavi was talking about, I think it's kind of addressing the idea of like what's normal and like what's typical as well. I think it also has been reaching out to different aspects just beyond disabilities and developmental disorders. But so I definitely do think that it's inclusive right now as well.
Yeah, that's really true. And I think the main dispute for this comes from the fact that neurodiversity or just developmental disorders in that category was limited to behavioral disorders for most. And so the hesitation comes to include neurological disorders that involve movement, and including that in the same category, even though uh, both sorts of disabilities stem from the brain and the nervous system, is something that I think needs to happen, but might take some time.
Yeah. So now that we understand what neurodiversity is and how the entire idea is set around understanding and appreciating each unique brain for what it is, we also have to consider how this applies to our terminology. Words have so much power because of how influential everyday language is on the way people think and feel. Therefore, when discussing topics in the disability community, it is so important to get the language correct. When we've established that what is normal or abnormal is really quite arbitrary, since we have to look at each person on an individual case-by-case basis, we have to understand how referring to neurodiverse individuals as disabled might be misleading. Let's contrast the terminology. Differences or disabilities? In education, for example, Thomas Armstrong, executive director of the American Institute for Learning and Human Development and an award-winning author and speaker, argues that special education is weighed down by a history emphasizing deficit, disorder, and dysfunction, and needs to change its approach. As an alternative approach, Armstrong recommends neurodiversity should be valued like other aspects of individual identities rather than seen as deficits. Do you guys agree with Armstrong, and how might the special education system change if it is used in this approach, and how might students' lives be different?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with what Armstrong is saying. I mean, even if we go historically, 1975, we've got the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And following that, there's been many different research studies done by like Novak Education and different institutions that shown that individuals with disabilities benefit the most when they're in an inclusive and learning environment. And when we say terms like special education or the special needs, I think we're stigmatizing people with disabilities. But instead, if we take neurodiversity in a lens that it's something that should be appreciated and it's an essential part to someone's identity, I think it's going to be really beneficial to individuals with disabilities and not only their academic growth, but also their personal growth.
Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, like mental health, especially because when special education is like weighed down by deficit, disorder, dysfunction, like when people are saying that that part of someone's identity, that part of someone's like person is negative and is something that's like not a difference, but something that's going to bring them down rather than just being a different part of who they are. And that sort of thing really like drags on a person's self-worth and makes them not feel normal when in reality they just behave differently. And I mean, they're still a person too. And so like Dhruv said, calling it special needs rather than just like, I don't know, another class is something that I think is one of the things that probably should be changed. Just changing that name itself would truly give a lot of kids just better self-esteem, I think, and make them realize that like their identity as a person with a disability like isn't wrong. Yeah.
Right, and like that, it's almost like shameful, and exactly why neurodiversity emphasizes the individual and therefore recognizes a learner's strengths along with their weaknesses. And our current special education system, according to Armstrong, holds fast to the diagnostic categories it puts students into. Like labeling a student can be really detrimental to that student's progress, like you said. And in our current system, when a student gets a disability label, they're often segregated from their peers and receive remedial instruction. And this cannot only significantly demotivate, but can keep that student behind. So, do you guys think that labeling a student as having a disability itself is a problem, or when might a label be helpful, or when might it create a problem?
I think being aware that a student needs accommodations is very different from treating them in a way where like they're a burden. Because you can always like support students by providing extra help, but completely pulling them aside into a separate class. Like I remember in my elementary school, like the special education classrooms were kind of depressing. And so like pulling them aside from everybody else and making it seem like they are something that they are people that shouldn't interact with other people, like it really isn't correct, I think. And as if they didn't label it as a disability, but rather just a student who needs certain accommodations, that would make their difference in their ability a lot more positive rather than negative.
Yeah, I think to just further that, I was reading a Medium article and it was talking about like when you label someone, especially like a student with disabilities, you focus more on their disabilities rather than the person themselves. And when you see them, it's more like you just see those disabilities. When you continuously label someone like that, it's super negative. But as you said, I think there is a difference between providing students with the extra support that they might need and providing accommodations versus intentionally just labeling them to kind of differentiate themselves from other students in the class.
Right, and I agree, and I think that like in an ideal world, every every teacher would be equipped with all the resources to handle like all sorts of diverse students and in the same classroom, and that's what we should be working towards. And yet, what we have like the problem is where students are having to like deprecate because of that distinction that's being made. But at the same time, I think that we also have to be careful to what extent we change our terminology from like acknowledging the disability to completely ignoring it. Like, for example, the words challenged and handicapped are widely recognized as offensive, yet the phrase differently abled, that perhaps is well-meaning in its intent to focus on the ability rather than disability, is for that very reason most insulting, because the phrase sets the pretense that a health condition is an interesting set of abilities and ignores the nature of the condition. With a physical, mental, developmental, or other health condition, it means your body is interfering with day-to-day activities, and rather than these being unusual abilities, they aren't abilities at all. They're often health conditions that are disabling. And referring to a disability as a different ability ignores the struggles that people with disabilities go through on a daily basis. So rather than using a disability as a sort of diagnostic end all be all, we can understand each person for who they are, which is really the key to neurodiversity. And the best way to provide a normal life to the neurodiverse would be to accept those individuals as they are and not as society expects them to be. And yes, that was our discussion about neurodiversity and what it entails. We hope you were able to learn a couple of things and how to ensure equity for those with disabilities. If you're interested in hearing more, join us in our next episode discussing ableism. And for now, have a great day.